The following video is an expression of opinion. You may disagree, and that's okay. Also, I've done my best to include relevant footage and screenshots where I can find them. Diversity and inclusion can be a difficult thing to discuss. It's often associated with certain political views, especially when it comes down to discussions of it in online spaces, which tends to cause a discrepancy in how exactly to approach it. The other difficulty that media faces is that what diversity and inclusion actually means varies from person to person. The intricacies of a progressive approach are far too complex to be universal, and every game must approach it differently. Games such as Goodbye Volcano High and Life is Strange have their queerness as a core part of their identity. Animal Crossing New Horizons isn't a queer game inherently, though it is more than happy to allow you to play as you wish, dress as you want, and express yourself however you'd like. In regards to talking about inclusion for inclusion's sake, there is an argument to be made that even bad faith inclusion is better than no inclusion at all, as it's still exposing people to queer identities and relationships. This does make a queer reading of it particularly easy, and is potentially why there's a decent sized LGBTQ+ community surrounding the game. There is a question of whether a game should seek diversity or whether it should focus on delivering a fun experience. Inclusion for the sake of it is significantly less genuine, and if it isn't coming from a good place, is it really inclusion? Should a game be criticised if it isn't very inclusive? Well, that's what's been on my timeline recently, enough that I deactivated my Twitter account. Let's address the monkey in the room and talk about diversity and inclusion in Souls and their likes, and why the Screen Rant comment has a point. This video is not commenting on whether the review in question is correct. I'm not saying whether Black Myth Wukong has good diversity and inclusion. I haven't played the game, I'm not qualified to confirm or deny it. However, it does appear that parts of the Screen Rant review are incorrect, such as them saying that there are no characters who identify as women in the game. Now that people have had a chance to actually play the game, it appears that that's wrong. So, there's that. Various reports have claimed the journalist is employed at a consultancy company, which may motivate them in order to make certain comments. I don't know whether this is true or not, but this doesn't really affect the video either. I think the idea of citing a lack of diversity as a negative is justified, and the response attempting to explain why there is a lack of diversity made for a debate I wanted to explore. This is a separate discussion to whether the review is right. The criticisms I'm responding to in this video are not impacted by the developer's motive or whether the review is correct. This is a hypothetical discussion that uses Black Myth's controversy as a focal point. Black Myth Wukong is mentioned as it serves as a good case study. People made a lot of claims before any of the new information came to light, and made some arguments that I think are interesting discussion points. Whether the journalist had ulterior motives or whether it's one side making things up to justify their own misogyny is not an argument I'm having, and it's not one I'm going to engage with. Anyway, back to what I was saying. Now, this isn't a video that intends to render the arguments by those who denounce the Screen Rant review in question mute. I overall think people are entitled to how they feel regarding the matter, though I do think people were a tad too passionate on it. There were a lot of people weighing in rather aggressively, and in this video I want to discuss that and try to both understand and deconstruct the other side of the argument. Cool? Let's begin. The review period of Black Myth Wukong led to a particularly venomous exchange regarding diversity and inclusion, driven by a particular line in Screen Rant's article. Whilst praising the game's visuals, its combat, as well as elements of its story, it took aim at technical shortcomings as well as a lack of diversity and inclusion. Much of the following discussion criticised the decision to lower a game's review score based on what some viewed as unfair criteria. Some took it as an opportunity to yell about the woke mob or something derivative of that, but it would be malpractice of me to pretend that the general gaming populace who took issue with the comment did so on those grounds, especially when you consider that there was definitely a crowd that self-identified as woke. The idea, or at least as I perceive it, is that Black Myth Wukong is a game that isn't attempting to tell a queer story, and docking it points because it isn't trying to is unjust and shows a lack of journalistic objectivity. Just because a game doesn't have a lesbian or a gender-fluid character, it doesn't make it worse, it's just not catering to what you may want from a game. And I do feel like that is a fair point. A game being fun is king, it's the thing that developers should be focused on, as a game having good representation won't make a game interesting to play. I smell a counterpoint. Video games are a special medium. They can tell stories that speak to your soul and can do so in a way that other forms simply cannot. The ability to directly interact with the world creates a relationship that can just not be rivaled in film or music. But this means nothing if a game is unable to connect with people. If its story and themes do not have impact, then you have failed at character writing. Inclusive elements are a way for characters to be identifiable to a greater group of people, and reaching a greater group of people cannot be a bad thing. Being diverse is not a negative, and wishing a game acknowledged more groups of people makes sense. Also, it's not like you can't do both. Just because you have good inclusion doesn't mean you also can't have good gameplay. Games, and especially their reviews, are subjective by nature, and I'll go on record to say, I think people were far too mad about this. It's unlike the internet to get needlessly angry at an opinion after all. The old saying still rings true: I love game reviews until they express an opinion I don't agree with. I'm being flippant about this for a bit, but the point is that wishing for better diversity and inclusion makes sense as a wish. You can disagree with that, but let's not start a whole crusade against someone for wanting that. In a subjective review. A further complication is that the game is an adaptation of Journey to the West, a Chinese novel that serves as a fictionalized retelling of a pilgrim's voyage. Given that it draws from subject matter that is centuries old, the expectation that its contemporary forms have to express modern-day sensibilities is one that many people do not quite agree with. Much of the support for Screen Rant was met with this simple question. It's based on a Chinese myth. What did you expect? Adaptation is a quagmire of traps and tripwires to navigate, being simultaneously charged with remaining faithful to the source material whilst also justifying its existence is a tricky task, one made even more complex in the form of video games. A question that will always remain in adaptation is why this existing story needs to exist in a new medium. Why does this book need to be a video game when it accomplishes whatever it's attempting to do in its original mode of expression? A common answer is that it is an opportunity to introduce the story to a new audience that may or may not have been interested in the original form. If this is why Black Myth Wukong exists, then that's fair, I guess. As language has evolved over time, classical literature that has roots in mythology can be rather dense to explore, and thus a new medium is an opportunity to strip the narrative to its core so that the ideas can be consumed in a simpler way. However, bringing an old text to a new medium is another headache. Consider that if a video game sets out to adapt a text that is more than a few decades old, it's incredibly likely that it outdates the form altogether. This means that changes are inevitable, as whatever the original text was, chances are it didn't account for the interactivity of the medium at all. The idea that Black Myth Wukong is justified in its lack of inclusion and diversity due to its nature as an adaptation of Journey to the West is, in the simplest terms, cheap. By bringing a classical text into the modern day and into a modern medium, they shouldn't be surprised if someone examines that with a modern lens. Now with that said, it's important to address the idea of modern day sensibilities. It's entirely formed by my own perspective as someone from the UK. China has some rather antiquated views on LGBTQ+ expression. Whilst it's not illegal to be in a same-sex relationship, it is illegal to marry. Certain discrimination laws do not extend to protecting members of the LGBTQ+ community, and it is known that regardless of law, people are heavily disadvantaged and treated differently if they identify outside of the heteronormative binary set by society. Queer stories can often come from someone drawing from their own experiences, and it's possible that a Chinese studio may discriminate against a queer person and choose not to hire them, or that someone may not feel comfortable telling that story due to what society may think of them. I would like to say that this is obviously a very generalized approach based on someone who attempted to research this as best as possible, but obviously does not know the intricacies of China's system. Few people are qualified to comment on China's systematic views on the LGBTQ+ community, and so it's often brought up as a last-second defense. Black Myth Wukong's representation isn't particularly good because it reflects a society that is very slowly acknowledging a form of expression and has a way to go until it gets to a good place. And that is a good response. In theory, justifying something isn't the same thing as disproving it. A criticism can be just as valid regardless of whether there is a reason for it or not. I'll give you a much more lame example, but it does the trick. The audio in these videos isn't perfect. It's passable, I think, but it could be a lot better, and the reason for this is because I'm using a cheap USB mic I got on Amazon 3 years ago. I'd love to get an audio interface so I can use the nice condenser a friend gave me, but I can't afford it right now. But the criticism that the audio sometimes sounds like I'm yelling through a hurricane or constantly has seagulls in the background is valid as well. The reason doesn't change that, and China's attitude towards LGBTQ+ sensibilities making it so Black Myth Wukong isn't the most diverse game doesn't make the criticism any less true. It just provides context for it, which is important for the entire discussion, but that doesn't make the criticism any less sound. We all seek different things in games, but if you're entitled to your view relating to whether the criticism is valid or not, the reviewer is also entitled to the comment that started the whole debate. This isn't a video that intends to disprove those who took issue with a Screen Rant review. If you feel that reducing a game's review score due to a criteria that it's most likely not trying to meet due to either a production decision to prioritize other things or cultural elements is unfair, then I do see where you're coming from. But the purpose of this video isn't just for me to discuss and present the side in support of the review, it's also because I want to talk about what I think is the underlying cause to such a vocal backlash. The gaming industry doesn't care about diversity. I heard this comment a lot over the course of the discussion. Why is it part of the review? No one cares about diversity and inclusion, focus on the important stuff. And from where I'm sitting, people just proved why the comment is warranted. People don't care about diversity and inclusion, but they should. The gaming industry is not known for its representation to the point of where companies have to create programs to recognize these people. It's disappointing these programs are needed to improve diversity and inclusion, but it's better than nothing. It's a step to improve it. This whole debacle, at least for me, is another example of how the gaming industry reacts to someone pointing out an inadequacy. When someone does or says something because they want to see a positive change. When it comes to the gaming industry's chance to prove that they want better things for the LGBTQ+ community, they turn away. And it's not the first time it's happened. The Hogwarts Legacy boycott was something of two halves. On one hand, you had a small group who were harassing creators and seeking anarchy, and then you had the real-life people who wanted to affect change, and felt as though voting with their wallet was the best way to go about it. Unfortunately, many opted to focus on the extreme rather than what the boycott was actually about, affecting change and not respecting someone who doesn't respect a minority, and spends her days conducting a witch hunt. People bought the game, knowing what the impact would be, knowing that there was a boycott in support of trans people, and choosing to do it regardless, claiming that they just wanted a fun game and not to care about politics. But the problem with politics is that inaction is a form of action. These are the same people who claim fellowship and being an ally and then go and put some money in JK Rowling's pockets. Genuinely didn't think it was that hard not to spend £60, but who knows. People should point out when something isn't right, the same way that when a game releases and it's buggy and unfinished, we give developers shit for it. I don't want to preach to you. I do agree that it's a difficult topic and everyone has their own views. People care about different things and that's obviously okay. But why is it that when someone calls out a lack of inclusion, people get their pitchforks out? I hope that we can get to a point in the gaming industry where diversity and inclusion, a topic that matters to a hell of a lot of people, can be considered in the same breath as game performance, visuals, and all the stuff we look for in a good game. Diversity isn't a bad thing, and better representation is something we can strive for. There may be a reason for something, but we can still challenge it and hope for a better tomorrow. Better inclusion is never a bad thing. Seeing a part of you in a character is a good thing, so when someone points out a problem with something, I don't get why you'd make it so that they have to remove their name from the review because they got so much hate. Now this is a very broad response to the backlash. I'm sure that the individuals didn't mean any harm, and that if it did come a time where they truly needed to support LGBTQ+ people, they would. But I'm tired and a naturally cynical person. I don't think people meant harm by criticising the Screen Rant review, but I do think the overall discussion is emblematic of the main problem. People don't care about diversity and inclusion in the video game industry, and they should. We should point out when a developer has a problematic history, or that a game isn't very good in its representation. We shouldn't crucify them for it, but we can start the discussion of why that is and how to improve it. This is the medium we love. Let's make it better then, and not yell at someone for wanting change. At least, that's my take on it. Overall, it's a good thing that people are enjoying Black Myth Wukong, I guess, but there is a conversation to be had here. This video is overall quite negative, so at some point I do plan to do a video talking about Souls games, and how I think some of them have pretty darn good diversity and inclusion. With that said, I hope everybody's having a good day, and if you are playing Black Myth Wukong, I hope you're enjoying it, and whatever you're playing, I hope you are having fun. And remember,
every time someone steps up and says who they are, the world becomes a better, more interesting place. So, thank you.